आज के एपिसोड में इन व्हाट द हेल इज़ गोइंग ऑन हम डीकंस्ट्रक्ट करेंगे कि बेसिकली डोनाल्ड ट्रंप की जो इतनी एग्रेसिव फॉरेन पॉलिसी है इसको ड्राइव क्या कर रहा है। स्पेसिफिकली आजकल जो हम ग्रीनलैंड और साउथ अमेरिका और कनाडा के साथ यूएस के रिलेशनशिप्स देख रहे हैं, व्हाट आर द ड्राइवर्स दैट आर बेसिकली ड्राइविंग दिस होल aggressive foreign policy. Now, a lot of people say that this is basically the US is doing this because of strategic or economic or other interests. However, it's much more deeper than that. The orthodoxy that I'm going to claim today is that it is much more deeper than just a strategic base in Greenland or Venezuela's oil or Canada's trade. This is basically the US exerting its influence over the Western Hemisphere. और इसका अगर हम कॉन्टेक्स्ट देखें तो वो ये है कि आफ्टर वर्ल्ड वॉर टू when the Soviet Union and the US, when they emerged, they had this clear, distinct, area of a sphere of influence. So the Soviet Union knew that we had the East, and the US knew that it had the West. But now with time, it has evolved into such that US has also started to lose its grip over the West. जो वेस्टर्न हेमिस्फेयर आपका बनता है जिसके अंदर आपका नॉर्थ एंड साउथ अटलांटिक और अमेरिकाज एंड नॉर्थ एंड साउथ अटलांटिक और उसके अलावा ग्रीनलैंड एंड आर्कटिक रीजन आता है ऊपर की तरफ से. So this is the whole reason why the US is basically pursuing these aggressive foreign policies against Greenland and Canada and South America, and that is why what is going on here. Let's deconstruct. Now, a question is supposed to be asked here: how is the US, the superpower of the world, losing its grip over the Western Hemisphere? Well, basically, it's very simple. So China has been slowly creeping up on the US in the Western Hemisphere. So China has done trade deals, economic deals, port and shipping, and among a vast array of deals with the South Americans, and they're basically penetrating in the backyard of the US. Venezuela, Mexico, Ecuador, Colombia, all of them have Peru for that matter. All of them have trade deals with the US. Sorry, with China. Now, this is unacceptable to the US because once you have Chinese access to their ports and Chinese access to their economies and Chinese access to their backyard, that translates into trouble because both the US and the China, obviously, the US claims that China is the single most biggest threat to their national security at this time. All of their reports are claiming this. So how can the US allow China to remain in its backyard? और इसी वजह से the US wants कि चाइना को वो इस रीजन से जहाँ पर वो क्रीप अप कर रहा है उसके ऊपर उसको रिमूव करे. So we're going to basically deconstruct it into three phases. The first one is South America, the second one is Canada, and the third one is Greenland. So let's talk about the South Americas. South Americas, Mexico and Saraniche, Argentina and Chile tak. All of these places, they constitute South America. Now, we saw that the US forces, they went into Venezuela, and then they kidnapped the president and they brought him back to the US. I think, and this is my obviously opinion and analysis, that Venezuela was never about drugs. Venezuela was never about the oil per se. Venezuela was more about sending the right message so that the South American nations can fall in line. So this was the message by the US कि भाई देखो ठीक है हो तुम लोग independent countries, but if I'm around, I'm the boss, and you have to listen to me. So it was a message. Generally, Venezuela, there were more objectives that had to be met. Obviously, they had oil, and oil ki ek aur, there was another aspect to it that the Chinese companies were there, or Chinese companies oil ko apna refine kar rahi thi, and they were, after refining it, they were like sending it back to China, and Russian companies were also taking their oil. But oil was just part of the game. It was not the complete picture. So Venezuela was a target. Drugs were an excuse. And secondly, जो आपकी Venezuelan drugs हैं, they're not directly, most of them don't even end up in the US. Venezuela is a narco trafficking state that mostly unki drugs they end up in Europe. So that is something that has nothing to do with the US. So basically, Venezuela was a message for South America to fall in line. That is it. So that South Americans, they understand that while the US is a superpower, they have to listen to him. They cannot be in bed with China. And that was the real reason why they did what they did. Secondly, let's come to the Arctic Circle. It is said that the World War III will probably take place because of the Arctic Circle. And that is because Russia has been heavily investing into the strategic missile defense systems, nuclear submarine systems, and all of other strategic and conventional military bases in the Arctic region. इस वजह से the US seems it's an urgency that we have to militarize and the Arctic region. Greenland is part of it, and not just militarize it, they want to dominate it, because generally अगर आप यूएस की ओवरऑल पॉलिसी को, इकोनॉमिक पॉलिसीज़, फॉरेन पॉलिसी, military policies को आप अगर study करो throughout the past, so the US does not like to share. The US likes to dominate completely so that it can have complete control over whatever they have, whatever they want to achieve. So they want to completely dominate the Arctic Circle, and they cannot do it if Russia is there. And if Russia is there and they don't have any presence in the Arctic Circle, it means that very essential shipping lines, very essential natural resources, they're going to be in Russia's control, and that is not acceptable at all. Obviously, it wouldn't be to any superpower. Now, the NATO countries are obviously against annexing of Greenland, definitely. However, it's something that they can never stop, because they understand that for many years they've taken their own security for granted. Donald Trump views Europe as someone who has been, exploiting the US, taking their money in NATO की form में, taking their forces, those resources that could have been used somewhere else in a better place for the benefit of the US. इसीलिए Donald Trump does not really appreciate NATO, and thinks that it's useless, and thinks that it's only exploiting the US and has no benefit for US at all. And इसी वजह से the second thing is that the US thinks that it has to take its own security in its own hands and cannot rely on the European allies. And the Europeans generally do not agree with Trump on everything, because they know that, they feel that, I wouldn't say they know that, they feel that okay, Donald Trump he's too close to Putin, and he gives Russia too much concessions, and Donald Trump's stance on Ukraine, that he wants to end the war in a way that in their favor, in their views, favors Russia more than Ukraine, and all of those things. इसके अलावा भी generally Europeans are more liberals. Donald Trump is more, ultra conservative and all. However, with that said, there is a lot of ideological clash between the two, and also his views on NATO, they're also very, problematic for the European Union. However, and NATO, however, it makes sense for the US, and they're basically trying to take their own security in their own hands, and they're trying to take their resources and put them in places that they think is much better utilized. Now, people ask, will the US do, a similar action like they did in Venezuela and take over Greenland? I don't think so. Maybe they can. I think they can. They're capable of it. अगर वो करना चाहेंगे तो वो कर लेंगे. इसको आप डिनाई नहीं कर सकते, बिकॉज जनरली जो मैंने हिस्ट्री में जितनी भी थोड़ी बहुत देखी है, आई थिंक दैट द US does what it wants to do, and it does not, it has like the capacity, the capability, the will, and if they want to do it, they'll do it. But will they? I don't think so. Maybe Greenland khud hi, would want to come to some terms. However, maybe not. I don't know. I'm on the edge. Jury is still out. Maybe in a couple of days I'll be in a better position to say. However, like I said, this is not just about कि ग्रीनलैंड में बेस चाहिए क्योंकि वहाँ पर हमने मिसाइल डिफेंस लगानी है, ग्रीनलैंड में बेस चाहिए क्योंकि हमें वहाँ के रिसोर्सेज चाहिए. दिस इज़ द US trying to reclaim the western hemisphere, अपना sphere of influence, so that it understands that we have a western hemisphere जो कि हमारे कंट्रोल में है, जिसको हम डोमिनेट करते हैं, जहाँ के लोग हमारी बातें मानते हैं, और वहाँ पर हम अपने बफर्स क्रिएट कर सकते हैं इन केस कोई कॉन्फ्लिक्ट होता है, कोई जंग होती है. अब अगर आप सोचो मैक्सिको के अंदर चाइनीज़ प्रेजेंस है, पोर्ट्स हैं, शिप्स हैं, और क्या कहते हैं, आर्कटिक सर्कल में रशियन प्रेजेंस है, और कोई जंग हो जाती है. सो द US डज नॉट हैव दैट रिएक्शन टाइम which it might have otherwise अपने western sphere of influence के अंदर. So the US needs these places strategically to have complete control over the western hemisphere. Now let's talk about Canada. Canada के साथ जो अगर आप खबरें खाली पढ़ो तो आपको नज़र आता है कि ट्रेड के ऊपर खिटपिट चल रही है. Makes sense, but it's not just that. So basically, trade is just one part of the whole situation. Canada generally ideologically does not align with the US. It does not. It's very liberal. It's very inclusive. It's just not the US right now, or the US government right now, I would say. However, ये सब खिटपिट होने के बाद कनाडा ने एक स्ट्रेटेजिक ब्लंडर कर दिया. मेरे नज़दीक कोई ब्लंडर है in the sense that it does not make sense for Canadians. Maybe it does to them, but it does not make any sense to me. They just went to China and they said कि China, let's have a strategic alliance, whatever that means, because the details of it are still unclear. कि स्ट्रेटेजिक अलायंस किस नौयत का होगा. सम कहते हैं इकोनॉमिक होगा, सम कहते हैं डिफेंस तक जाएगी बात. आई डोंट नो, विल सी, फ्यूचर में पता चलेगा. बट विद दैट सेड, लेट्स सी क्या होता है. नाउ Canada, as soon as it enters an alliance with the Chinese, then clearly they're antagonizing themselves even more. Now it's good to have relations with China, but when you do it just out of spite for the US, or आप उसके neighbor हो, like are you like what are you even thinking? आप का दिमाग शमाग शायद, आई डोंट नो, चलो खैर छोड़ो, ऐसे नहीं कहना चाहिए. खैर, विद दैट सेड, कनाडा जस्ट वेंट ऑन. अब चाइना ने उनको वेलकम किया. चाइना वाज लाइक हाँ करते हैं, आओ लेट्स हैव अ स्ट्रेटेजिक अलायंस. हाउएवर, चाइना ऑल्सो नोज कि यार ये कैनेडियंस जो है ना, एक्सक्यूज माई फ्रेंच, बट थोड़े से ना फट्टू हैं. तो एज सून एज द यूएस इनको आंखें दिखाएगा, मे बी they'll run away. However, they welcomed them and they were like, let's talk about it, whatever happens. इसके बाद what will happen is कि China would know कि we have Canada on our side, so let's try to exert some more pressure by having presence in the north of the US यानी कि Canada में, and things would again, वही वाली बात है, the US would feel extremely insecure. So ultimately, what I'm trying to say is, with the Chinese presence in the south of the US, Mexico, Venezuela, Ecuador, Colombia, Peru, Argentina, and everywhere else, the US is insecure. It's just that simple. It feels like the US is losing its grip, because if you're in trade or relations with China, you have money ruling, you have a partnership, you will not listen to the US. So you've lost your sphere of influence. If the Canadians do the same, you've lost your sphere of influence. If NATO and European Union, who are also drifting away because of Trump's, views or his ideology, if they also slip away, and then you have the Russians building their presence in the Arctic, that is problematic. So it all makes sense. It all makes sense why he's so aggressive, because this is an existential threat to the US, and this is the US exerting itself as a superpower. So let's see where it goes. However, this is what's happening. It's not just about उनको तेल चाहिए था और उनको बेस बनाना था और उनको ट्रेड रूट्स चाहिए थी. It's much more than that. This is the US की national security.